I had the assumption for a long time that the term birding was just shorthand for bird watching. And I would use those terms kind of interchangeably until one day recently, Dustin, where I was working on some content for Hike and Hearth, and you corrected me and asked me to use the term bird watching in a specific instance of some of the content I was working on. And so, what I thought we could cover as this week's question of the week is, what is the difference between bird watching and birding? Because I get the impression from you that they're not exactly the same thing.
I agree, but I'll ask you to clarify. Did I ask you to use bird watching or did I insist you use birding?
I believe I was using the term bird watching and you asked me to change it to birding.
So I will say bird watching and birding overlap quite a bit, but they're not one and the same. My first piece of advice is to think of birding as bird watching evolved into a more encompassing activity. So first off, bird watching typically entails observing birds in their natural habitat, but it's usually pretty casual and recreational. You can do it anywhere, no matter, if you're driving, whatever, but it's not typically your primary purpose when you're bird watching. Bird watchers will use binoculars, field guides, a lot of the same tools and apps that birders will do. And bird watching is certainly accessible to everyone, but accessibility is one of the key points to lean toward the term birding instead of bird watching. So let's talk about what birding is that separates it from bird watching. And first off, I would say that birding is when you're doing it more as your primary purpose. You went looking for a specific bird or looking for birds generally, but that is your purpose and often involves traveling to a place to do it, whether it's walking off your property, going hiking, going for a drive, going to Costa Rica for an ecotourism trip. When your primary purpose is looking for birds, that's definitely birding. And also it's multi-sensory. So bird watching, without us realizing it, focuses the activity on watching and happens to be birds. But birders, when they go out birding, they're not just watching. They're listening, they're studying, they're thinking about the species and the habitat and the behaviors. And it's a much more immersive experience thinking about all of those things. A lot of birders also focus on like listing and creating checklists of species they've seen either on their trip or in their year or in their locality or on their life list. So keeping records and participating in the citizen science and the conservation of that is also key to birding. And also lastly, birding is just a much more inclusive term because, for example, one of the best birders I ever met was my friend Grant Marley. And Grant at the end of his life was blind. So bird watching wasn't really his thing, but birding definitely was his thing. And he was excellent. He had been sighted earlier in his life, and health challenges made him blind toward the end of his life. But he was still a great birder and a great person to go birding with. And using that term is certainly more inclusive in today's day and age.
Oh, that's a really good point. And I like that you made that point. Okay. So I kind of get what you mean by the way you defined birding and bird watching, but I think I'm still a little stuck on the bird watching point and what exactly makes that a little different. So could you what are the differences between birding and bird watching if you were to compare the two?
Yeah. So the first one I'd say it's passive versus active. Bird watching, you're doing something else and you happen to be watching the birds while you're doing it, right? You're out gardening, you're hiking, and birding is a secondary activity versus it being the primary purpose of whatever you're doing, right?
Okay.
I often go off into the woods with the explicit purpose of seeing every bird I can see, and everything else is gravy.
And that's interesting because I'm the exact opposite. So I'm a bird watcher, right?
Yes.
It's funny, I've said multiple times throughout our episodes that I'm not a birder and I'm bird adjacent. And that's kind of true. Mm-hmm. But I like to go out hiking. And I'm primarily, for some reason, attracted to the trees and the foliage and like looking at the plants. But if I see an interesting bird cross my path, I will stop and look at it. So I'm a bird watcher.
Yes. And maybe even a reluctant one at times, but yes. But then the next is sort of the intensity, right? Like Birding is a little bit more goal driven because you might be wanting to go see a specific species you have in mind, right? You're after that snowy owl and you're going to drive to get it or something like that. Or you really want to go find some new birds for your life list and so you're actively planning a trip around finding those birds or getting yourself into a place to be successful to find those birds. Or maybe it's just to go out and count all the species that you can because you enjoy, being immersed in the sights and sounds of that kind of stuff. But birding is more goal oriented than bird watching. So, in addition to intensity, I would also say depth of the experience matters to birders as well. Often they're studying more than just the birds. There's the behavior, the habitat, the circumstances that occur, and then often connecting that to the weather, climate change, habitat conservation, all those deeper level things are something birders are more into. And the tools that they use are usually more involved as well, right? A bird watcher probably is just looking through the window or maybe using binoculars and an app or a book, full stop. And then birders are when they've gotten to the more serious level and they might be using a spotting scope, a long telephoto lens, that kind of thing.
Would you say that like birding is like the more intensive and scientific version of bird watching? Because it seems to me as you're talking, bird watching is just more casual. You're out there in the woods or on the coast or wherever, just trying to experience nature in general. And if you come across a bird, you're going to have that experience too. Whereas a birder is a more scientific study. You're documenting things like you're using more sophisticated equipment to gather data on what's out there.
Certainly for understanding, I would think some people are more about the personal observation and just being immersed in watching what's going on, not necessarily the scientific part of it, but absolutely. If you're into it for the science, it's birding.
That's interesting because to me as a scientist, observation, whether you realize it or not, is a scientific study.
Yeah, it's true. But if you're not wanting to document it and spread it to others, to me, there's not the pushing forward of the science of it. It's really just learning versus science.
Okay. All right. So that was our tangent for this episode. So we covered the differences between the two. Where is the common ground between birders and bird watchers? Like what areas, where is their overlap?
Well, the biggest thing is joy, right? No matter what level of the activity that you're doing it, bird watchers are experiencing the same kind of joy that birders do, particularly in those moments where something unexpected shows up, right? Maybe it's simple as a cardinal showing up on your feeder that you haven't seen a cardinal before or something. That's great, right? Or maybe it's a Cooper's hawk diving at the bird under the feeder or something like that. That's rewarding, even if it was unplanned and unsought for, right? Either side has it equally. But often bird watchers start to evolve into birders and they start to get more immersed into it. Both share a love for nature and usually conservation, those sorts of things. And both can take that love and passion forward and use it to motivate them into conservation efforts, whether it's, local land acquisition and conservation, maybe it's trail maintenance, maybe it's nest box support and monitoring, those sorts of things.
Okay. All right.
And then lastly, I would just say, like, when in doubt, use birding. Birding is a more serious, more inclusive term. So if you're ever not sure, always default to birding.
Got it. Okay. That makes sense. So you consider yourself a birder?
Yes. I probably made that transition 10 or 12 years ago, and I'd ask our listeners or watchers, like, what do you consider yourself, a bird watcher or a birder? And has this conversation maybe changed that analysis of yourself?
Yeah. And I would also say, if you're going to respond in the comments to this video, letting us know if you're a birder or a bird watcher, what I love to hear is the stories of how people got into bird watching or birding. So if you go to our website, hikeandhearth.com, and click on our About page, Dustin has his story posted right there of how he got into this as a passion and a hobby. And it was accidental, right? It wasn't like you were looking for a hobby and just decided, oh, bird watching sounds like the right approach. You stumbled on it.
Yeah. I mean, bird watching casually was instilled in me maybe by my grandparents who were into having a feeder station outside their big picture window, but they would feed birds and kind of watch them over coffee and stuff like that. When we moved to this lake, it took a couple of years for me to start to realize the pattern of the seasons and the migrating waterfowl. And then the first time a rose-breasted grosbeak showed up on the feeder, and I knew, oh, that's a bird I haven't seen before. I want to make sure I record it and the date so that I understand like that I've seen it before, that was the moment where that sort of spark bird and the interest in the diving ducks, which I hadn't noticed before, got me interested in like what they're diving for and why are they only here in March and October and those sorts of things. And that's where I made the leap.
And to close it out, one more thing, you used the term spark bird. So if we have any beginner birders watching right now, can you define that term and tell us what your spark bird was?
Sure. This is a hard question for me because I don't have a definitive spark bird. But a spark bird is the bird that sort of trips your instinct to want to learn more about birds and get you into the bird world. So for some people, it might be a unique bird showing up at the feeder. It might be a bald eagle that landed on your porch railing and stunned you or something like that. Who knows, right? Everybody has their own gateway into birding, and often it was a specific bird or a specific experience with a bird that really got you interested and sparked your love of learning about birds.
And you don't have one?
I don't have a specific one, but I used to flip through an old Audubon nature guide, and I would always come to cedar waxwings and look at that bird and be like, man, that's a beautiful bird. I'm never going to see one of those. I'll be lucky if I ever see a cedar waxwing. And then when I started to get in tune, I realized, oh, I can see a cedar waxwing almost any day of the year where we live. And I do see them now multiple times per month. That was one that the first time I saw a cedar waxwing and made the connection that, oh, that wasn't this this impossible dream kind of thing, that made me want to do that for other species too.
Well, that was our question of the week, difference between birding and bird watching. And we look forward to hearing all your comments. Are you a birder? Are you a bird watcher? What was your spark bird that got you into this hobby? Yeah. Thanks for answering that question, Dustin. Any final words you want to share?
Just a reminder to our friends to keep your eyes on the skies and your hearts in the wild. See you soon.
Bye, everyone.